It's a great pleasure to welcome today's guest, Susan Greenfield. As you'll know very well, Baroness Greenfield is a prominent scientist, writer, broadcaster, and a member of the House of Lords. She specialises in the physiology of the brain and researches the impact of 21st century technologies on the mind, how the brain generates consciousness, and novel approaches to neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So she's not idle, I think it's fair to say. Susan appears regularly on radio and television and has written a wide range of books on issues relating to the mind and the brain for the general reader. She joins us today to introduce her latest work called Mind Change. In the book and in her talk for us this afternoon, she'll explore the implications of the vast range of technologies which now shape and influence the daily rhythms of our lives, the way we work, learn, make and sustain relationships. How can we ensure that these powerful forces bring out the best in us and allow us to lead more meaningful, creative lives? The format is that Susan will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. I'll ask her about 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll open up to the audience as a whole. And we'll end about 5 to 2 today to give Susan time to meet people individually at the end. Now, the main thing I wanted to say today is that the event is, we're very, very glad that Susan's here to join us, and very happy to speak about her book. But we also want to keep focused on the ideas, keep focused on the big picture of what this book's arguing, and less about Susan as public personality. And we're looking forward to getting into the meat and bones of this.
Coming up behind me as I speak.
No, it won't be. It won't be.
Something.
Which is a relief. But it won't be. But to keep that in mind when we ask the questions. But without any further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome Susan Greenfield.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jonathan, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a great relief that that's not going to move now. That's just staying up. That's great. Yeah. Slightly distracting. I would hope, actually, that you wouldn't tweet as I speak, because I remember once being at some very fancy breakfast with Nick Clegg, and the lady next to me was so busy tweeting. She was having breakfast with Nick Clegg. She actually didn't listen to what he was saying. So although you might feel a great urge to do that, I would hope that in between the inputs of my mouth opening and shutting and your fingers going, there is a sort of period when there is some time for reflection. What I'd like to do in terms of preamble for introducing Mind Change, I'm sure you've come with lots of thoughts and preconceptions, is actually to start with the neuroscience, because I think it really is important in order to position the prism through which I have seen these issues, but also because I think it's important to grasp just how special your brain is and your mind is in order to realize the impact that the environment, any environment, is going to have on it. I'm assuming that most people here are not neurologists, is that right? Yeah, because no, I'm going to do this one day and there's going to be an audience of neuroscientists and neurologists in Mufti. You know? So if a neuroscientist is here or two, please forgive me if I tell you what you know very well, but I think it's important. So let's start off with what we mean by a mind. After all, it's half of the title of the book. What do we mean by a mind? How is it different from a brain? How is it different from consciousness? Well, let's take, of those 3 terms, the one that we're not going to talk about at all today, which is consciousness. I'll very happily, through the website, answer issues on that if you wish, or refer you to books I've written, but the main goal here is not to talk about this miracle of turning water into wine that we're doing every moment we're awake, but rather to think about something that I think can be distinguished from consciousness, and that's the mind. After all, you wouldn't have 2 terms otherwise. And when you go to bed tonight and lose your consciousness, you're not going to blow your mind, are you, or lose your mind? And similarly, you can blow and lose your mind, but at the same time, when you do so, you're still conscious. So what I would like to do is, first of all, clarify that we're going to talk about something that endures, something that's not fleeting, something you're not going to lose tonight or when the anaesthetist comes at you, something that is all about you, something that no one else has had for the 100,000 years we've stalked this planet, nor will they ever again. And even if you're a clone, an identical twin, you have a unique mind. It is your personality, if you like. In fact, it's the basis of that. Even on a desert island, when your personality wouldn't be apparent one way or the other, your mind is, it's how you see the world as opposed to how the world sees you. So from a neuroscientist angle, Jonathan's fessed up he's a philosopher, and I'd love to have his take on what philosophers think of the neuroscience view of the mind. But there are many philosophers, I'm sure he's not one of them, that like to draw distinctions between the mind and the brain. The first point I want to make is that I think they are inextricably linked. So let's just unpack that. What makes you different from a goldfish? Let's be brutal, the goldfish doesn't have a great personality, does it? It doesn't have a great character. And I've said many times, if your kids had a goldfish and it died, you could go while they were at school and buy another goldfish, and they'd come home and wouldn't know any difference. Whereas you couldn't do that with cats or dogs, and you certainly couldn't do it, even though they might wish you to, with their brothers or sisters. And that's because as we evolve, as we become more sophisticated, it's not to say that genes aren't important, of course they are, but they're much more important for the goldfish, because that's why they have a limited repertoire. They have the tyranny of a very fixed stereotype repertoire of behavior, unlike us, who, of course, have much greater latitude for all the opportunities and behaviors that we have. So it's this that differentiates us, this ability to interact with the environment and have individual experiences. And guess what? If you have individual experiences, you're going to become, unlike the goldfish, an individual. And this is why we occupy more ecological niches than any other species on the planet. We don't run particularly fast, we don't see particularly well, we're not particularly strong compared to many animals, but gosh, what we are superlative at is learning at adapting. So my first message to you is your experiences are going to determine very much your view of the world, if you like, your mind. How does this happen? Well, when you're born pretty much with all the brain cells that you need at the time, but it is the growth of the connections between the brain cells that accounts for the growth of the brain after birth. And it's astonishing, even in the first 2 years of life, you can see this changing of connections. And now, why that's exciting is these connections will be unique to you, even compared to your twin. They will have a unique configuration that's endlessly changing as you have your unique experiences. And this is something called plasticity. It doesn't mean to say the brain is plastic, of course. It comes from the original meaning of the word plastikos, to be molded. Let me give you two very brief examples of the astonishing plasticity of your brain, which accounts for why you are so individual. One is very famous, of London taxi drivers. You may have heard of this. Certainly the London taxi drivers have heard of this study, if you talk to them. And it involves the fact that, as you know, they have to learn all the streets of London, and they have to be able to recite to an examiner in an oral exam without recourse to a manual, all the one-way streets of London, how you'd get from A to B, respecting all those prohibitions. Now, to do that, they have a huge burden on what's called their working memory. And interestingly enough, in brain scans, one of the areas in the brain related to memory, it's an area called the hippocampus, is astonishingly in scans larger in London taxi drivers than in people of the same age. And it's not that having a big hippocampus predisposes you to being a London taxi driver, because, well, you have to think of these things, because the difference is more marked for the longer they've been driving. Now, perhaps not many people here are planning any day soon to become London taxi drivers, but perhaps many of you play the piano or have kids that play the piano. And this is an even more exciting experiment that I would like to challenge a philosopher with. It involves 3 groups of adult human volunteers. None at the beginning of the experiment had experience of playing the piano. And the first group, if you get a chance to volunteer for an experiment like this, try and not be in the control group, because they just stared at a piano for 5 days. So, as always, the poor old controls miss out. So anyway, so they were staring at the piano. Then there was a second group who learnt 5-finger piano exercises. And even in 5 days, forget about 2 years of training to be a cabbie, even within 5 days you could see an astonishing change in the brain territory relating to the digits as the people were learning this specific activity as they were rehearsing it. But the most exciting group that I would love to talk to philosophers about is the third group merely were asked to imagine they were playing the piano. And their brain scans were pretty much the same as those that had physically learnt these new exercises. So I think there's lots of things that we can talk about on that, not that we have time. I'm just going to summarize. The first is you can't really distinguish between mental and physical, as though feelings and thoughts were in some kind of ether out there, and people like me deal with the squalor of the chemistry of the brain, and the two are completely unrelated. Obviously, that's not the case. The other important thing was that as far as the brain was concerned, the exciting and interesting part was not so much the contraction of the muscle, it was the thought that had preceded it. And this leads into a wonderful quote from the man who developed the treatment for Parkinson's disease in the last century, a man called Horner-Kowitz. He said this, he said, "Thinking is movement confined to the brain." Just digest that for a moment. It does beg the question, and this is totally relevant to what we're going to discuss later with the impacts of technology. What is a thought anyway? If we're saying things change your thinking, what do we mean by a thought? How is it different from a feeling? Well, just consider the tail-wagging dog or the purring cat or the gurgling baby or yourselves if you're having a good night out, you shriek or you cry or you laugh, having an emotion, expressing an emotion. How does that differ from a thought? Well, I'd like to suggest to you that irrespective of the nature of that thought, be it a business plan, a logical argument, a fantasy, a lie, a memory, a hope, anything, they all have one thing in common. They all have one thing in common. You end up in a different place than where you started. That is to say, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. And although it's not necessarily as cut and dried as that when you're having a thought, it nonetheless takes you to a different place. How do you get there? By a sequence of steps. Thinking is movement, sequence of steps confined to the brain. And I think this linearity is a really important issue to consider when we are thinking about, well, for want of a better word, we're thinking about thinking. Okay, so here we have the brain, this astonishing brain that is so exquisitely sensitive to the environment. What happens then when we're born? And I think, again, as by way of preamble, we need to think about how that makes you the person you are, how you see the world. So imagine when you're born, in the words of the great psychologist William James, into a booming, buzzing confusion. Lovely phrase. And you'll evaluate, well, you have no choice, in purely sensory terms. How sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright. So imagine when you're a little baby being confronted with something like a wedding ring. You might be attracted to it. After all, it's gold, it's shiny, you might want to roll it, you might want to stick your fingers through it, and physically, it might be something that attracts your attention, at least for a while. But gradually, as the weeks turn to months, turn to years, and as you may interact with other things like that you put on fingers, you'll learn that things like this go on fingers. And something gold and shiny, you can constrain it further, is different from all the other things that go on fingers, in that it will only go on one finger. And it will only go on one finger under certain circumstances. So that if you see someone with one of these gold things on their finger, it will mean something that other things on fingers do not mean. And then when you're grown, you might have one of your own. And it may be that this otherwise gold-looking generic thing is nonetheless the most important thing to you in your life because of all the associations that it triggers of your courtship, your partner, and so on. It might be the most precious thing to you. And or, as the years go on, let's say things go sour, it might be an object of the most bitterness as you go from the honeymoon to the divorce. You know, it might be something that evokes, again, very, very strong feelings that have changed. And all this complex feeling and emotion aroused by a simple gold shiny thing a baby would want to put in its mouth. What's changed? The object hasn't changed. It's up here what's changed. It's the connections. So your connections are personalizing your brain. Imagine when you're born, you'll see a series of abstract blobs and colors, and gradually you'll realize it's a face, and then it's the face of your mum. And then if mum features again and again and again in your life, and more associations are triggered with her, she'll mean something that other ladies do not. So I'd like to suggest to you the more connections you spawn around an object or a person, the more meaningful it is. Connections also have another valuable role. If I'd come on now this afternoon, having had a bad hair day, dressed as a ghost, say, let's just say, you know, draped in a white sheet, I doubt if anyone here would be very frightened, whereas a small child would be frightened, and incidentally also a dementing patient would be frightened. Now, why is this? Well, dementia is the mirror image, if you like, of development. Just as you grow lots of branches so you can make more connections in the young brain, those connections are dismantled, sadly, if you're a victim of this disease. It is a disease. It's a disease of older people, but it's not a consequence of aging. And if that happens, then you lack the checks and balances. You no longer have the personalized meaning you had as a child. So now you're back, again, sadly, to the booming, buzzing confusion. Now, we know the more that you interact normally with the environment, the more the brain is stimulated. And according to the particular neurons that are relevant, they will grow more branches. You're all familiar with use it or lose it, where in sport, the more you exercise muscle groups, the more they prosper. And if, as my brother, he broke his ankle recently, and he was astonished at how quickly his calf muscle atrophied as a result of not being used. Brain cells are operating on a similar use it or lose it principle, but what happens with them is that they grow branches. Now, why is that interesting or important? Well, by growing more branches, you're able to make more connections because you are increasing the surface area. And by making more connections, you can therefore have a meaning to things that you didn't before. One final point I'd like to make about this general, this is probably one of the most speedy introductions to neuroscience you've ever had, is when I mentioned about blowing the mind and losing the mind. So I'd like to just say the mind is the personalization of the brain through the dynamic configurations of connections, triggered in turn by your unique experiences. And it starts off as a one-way street, how sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright, but slowly as those connections form, it turns into a two-way dialogue. Every experience you are having will upgrade and update your connections, and every experience you're having will be judged and evaluated through the existing connections. So you're in this lovely dialogue with the outside world. And this gives you a narrative. It gives you a life story. Again, this linearity of a beginning, a middle, and hopefully in the dim future, the final end. Yeah? And everyone has their unique trajectory. And it's this that gives you the identity, I think, that we all so treasure, that makes you so special. And it's all due to the connections in your brain. Now, what about then when you blow your mind or lose your mind? What about when you have a sensational time? There are ways that ever since humanity stalked the planet, we have devised ways in which we can, if you like, not access or impair that connections, so you are back to being in the sensational world. If I said now, let's go out and have a cognitive time, who's going to come? Anyone? Oh, you're having cognitive time now, I hope. Yeah? So what do we mean by having a sensational time? Well, traditionally, wine, women, and song, drugs and sex and rock and roll, they all have a feature in common. They abnegate the sense of self. That is to say, either one's taking psychoactive agents that will impair the chemical transmission, or you're putting yourself in a scenario stripped of all cognitive content. Techno, sorry. Perhaps it's wildly out of date, but you probably know what I mean, where you have the beat, where the premium is on the flash of the lights or the beat of the music, and you've just let yourself go. You've let yourself go, you've blown your mind. Or whitewater rafting, you choose it, whatever way you want to do it. It's either very fast-paced or very strongly sensory, or one's taken agents. And the very word ecstasy in Greek, ecstasis, is to stand outside of yourself. We were discussing classics earlier. And this has been going ever since the time of Euripides, who wrote a play called The Bacchae, all about the wine force and the bread force, the need to have this balance. Now, what we know now, Euripides didn't know it, is a central player in this is an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And this is only mature in late teenage years, early 20s. And it is characterized, when it's underactive, the brain is characterized by recklessness, by high emotion, by living in the moment. You may recognize this profile in teenage children because it's not fully mature. Now they've got an excuse. They can say, if any young people are here, their prefrontal cortex hasn't fully kicked in yet. Yeah. Now, we also know that a chemical messenger called dopamine, a powerful chemical messenger that's released and does many things in the brain. Among other things, it's related to drugs of addiction, to arousal, and to reward processes. This will inhibit that frontal part of the brain. So you can see that if you are engaged in recreational drugs or play